Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this event today. I'll be walking you through the things I do as a DevOps or a platform engineer, in which I will show you how to apply DevOps thinking on Agentic AI systems. It's very similar to what we do with applications as well. Today, we're not talking about deep dive because I built it in .NET, in a .NET backend application with a front end uh, face on it. And at the same time, we're not going to discuss more about how to build AI agents. It's mostly like an application and how we're gonna integrate the DevOps thinking on it whenever we want to apply or to deploy it to production, not just on our local computer. So just a quick run through about me. I'm a platform engineer. I have experience with integration systems, doing a lot of DevOps support and architecture at the moment. I have exposure with serverless, cloud automation, scripting, and Kubernetes management. My background previously actually is a little unconventional. I was coming from a digital marketing background before I went through the tech industry. So in 2020, I make a pivot and decided to do my master's degree here at UA and eventually transition into tech. So now let's dive into our main topic. So let's start with a question. How many of you have built some, prototypes and AI systems in which you already finished it, but then now what's the next step? So like, have you seen a demo that looks really nice and it's working really well, but have you wondered like, how am I going to put this in production? Like, do I need to have a deployment strategy, or do I need to have a hosting website, or whatnot? So building a prototype on your local computer is just one half of the story. The other half is also like, how are you going to maintain it, or how are you going to eventually deploy it into the production environment? So some of the questions that you need to ask is, how are you going to deploy it? What hosting model are you going to deploy it in? Which platform? Maybe Azure or AWS, maybe Databricks if you have some advanced level on data kind of systems. And then another question would be, how about if there are a lot of traffic coming in or is going to use this application? How is it ready for it to be scaled? Um, what kind of scaling strategy do we need? And another one is, do we have automation? So this part is actually where the DevOps come in, where we have a CI/CD pipeline. Like whenever I do changes on my application, regardless if it's on the AI side or on the application side or on the front end side, for example, if I do changes, does it deploy right away to my production where I can actually rely on it that it's being checked correctly? And another thing that we also need to consider is, how do we keep our code consistent? So when we deploy resources, especially when dealing with cloud, so we have an app idea, for example, I created this application, so I want to put it somewhere, which actually hosted in cloud. How do we keep the code consistent in a way, like if other team members that will come in and ensure that it's gonna be consistent along the way whenever there are changes that's going to happen? So these are the kinds of questions that we need to ask. Now, before going to our next to the concepts that I'm going to introduce to you about DevOps, um, our demonstration later on. So I wanted to introduce first to you the different kinds of theories that I've learned along the way while I was learning about or going through my journey into platform engineering or DevOps engineering. So one of the things that really stood me out when I was still starting and until now is infrastructure as code. Earlier in the earlier sessions, a lot of people were talking about Bicep. For Azure, we have Bicep and we have Terraform. So it's actually a process where you put it in a code and then you deploy it. So you don't need to go to the portal. So this is the portal. So this is the Azure portal. You don't need to go and create it one by one. So infrastructure as code is actually really helpful if you're doing something that is in automation, in a way that if you want to deploy something or test something in the test environment or development environment, then it's easier for you to deploy very similar structure on your production environment. So with Terraform, it can deploy resources that you want to build or the infrastructure that you want to build for your application. And why does this matter? Because it actually helps you reduce all the errors that you gonna go to the portal and build it one by one, say for the testing environment or the development environment. You're gonna create all those resources. It's gonna take some time. It's gonna make a higher chances or probability that you're gonna have errors, and also you cannot detect changes that have been done. So with Terraform, whenever someone commits on the infrastructure side, so we have application code, we have front-end code, and then we also have the infrastructure code. So the infrastructure code, you are able to commit it in GitHub, for example, in any of your repository, and everyone can see it, what changes have been done. And at the same time, it can also be version controlled. Another concept that I also learned about having, like in my DevOps journey, is containerization. I always come across this whenever developers would want to deploy their whatever they're working on, like an application, and then they will always have this containerization. So for people, if you have any business idea or an app idea, containerization is really a very critical concept to learn, because it is where you package your application and then eventually host it into the cloud. Now, with our project, so our application is actually called Student Admission App. So coming from Navitas, so we're building applications that connects or integrations that connects to universities. And this is one of them. And well, it's not actually the one that we have, but this is like similar to what we have there. So if you look at it, so this is how the application looks like. And then the architecture side of things, this is how it looks like. So we have the front end on the left side, and then we have at the back end of it is actually the .NET API application, where it's actually containerized inside a Docker container. But then we have to push it somewhere in the cloud to host it. So that's where the Azure and the Terraform comes in. So the Terraform is the one that creates the resources in Azure, and then the back end will eventually be used, or the Docker container will be pushed into the Azure Container Apps. It's a resource in Azure. And then below it is actually all the other resources that we need for our AI application, because although this is an app, this has a slightly capability, an AI capability, which it uses some resources as well in Azure, which is called Azure OpenAI. Container registry is where we store our containers. And then the app insights, which is also a critical thing when building applications, it's where we create the observability stack, in which once you're in production, you want to monitor what's going on with your website. So having this in place is somewhat critical, in a way that whenever you want to upgrade the website, or whenever there are issues on the website, you can always go into these resources. And then just below it is actually the Terraform cloud, because we're using Terraform. And then the AI capability down here, which is actually the AI Open AI Assistant API, where if you look at it in Azure, all of these are being created here. So all of the resources have been created here. So they are called like the infra. It's taking time. Connection error. Why? Yeah. So anyhow, so in the middle, I'm sharing it to you because this is the DevOps side of things where we're using the GitHub Actions where because this is where we store all our code base, the repository that we're using, and it has a section where it actually okay, I don't have any internet. So the GitHub Actions, this is how it looks like. So it will run all your whenever you make changes on your repository, for example. So it will be the one who will automate all your processes instead of you um, going to your portal and create all of them or make the changes and upload it from there. The GitHub Actions will be the one to do it for you. And in the GitHub Action, it has all the steps. If you can see it from, for example, from the code, it has all the necessary steps here where you will have to go through a lot of different steps in a way before you can deploy the website. So one of the steps is actually testing it, and what another step is also linting the code base or maybe do a scan. So in that way, that whenever you deploy it in a certain environment or a target environment, regardless if it's development environment or a production environment, then it will just automatically go through those steps. So our step here is whenever we do changes, it will provision all the infrastructure in Azure and then build the React app and then eventually build the Docker container and then push it to the container registry and eventually deploy the resources on Azure. So yeah, this is the actual flow of the system deployment. And then with this one, actually, it's very similar. It's like a pattern that you can use with any applications that you're going to build. So you have the GitHub Actions pipeline, where someone it triggers the pipeline, a file has been changed, and then it will go through, identify which particular path it has changed, and then set up what it needs to be done for the step that it follows along the way. And eventually, at the end of it, it will update the resources inside the Azure resource group. So this is the demo, the links for our demonstration today. So I'm going to be showing you the demonstration. So this is our application. So for example, if you're a student and you're applying for a master's degree in UWA, for example. So if I'm going to go in, and I'm coming from a nursing background. So what it's going to do now is actually to, instead of submit straight ahead to our system, it will do a pre-assessment so that the admission officer don't necessarily need to grab all the information and make a decision or go through a decision and waste a bit of time before it can decide if the student is eligible for a particular unit or a particular course. So what we did is actually um, so once we submit this, is doing an evaluation, for example. But the evaluation is not coming from an if-else statement. Previously, yes, we do that. So we put a series of if-else statements in our application to analyze something that we want to. Say, for example, the student assessment. So it analyzes student inputs in a way. So, but what we did here is actually uploading a policy. So the Azure also has this policy, like it's like the Azure Foundry, where it accepts a certain file or certain files for you to create as a data that you can use for your AI. So it acts like somehow like an MCP server, but so this one actually is not coming from an if else statement. It's coming from the policy that I uploaded for this particular school. So the policy actually looks like downloads. So it looks like this. So it's actually um, a file that you can use and put it in your system in a way that it will be used to analyze or do an AI capability for your application. So you can be building any application, and then with the use of Azure resources, by the way, I'm using student account, so I'm not spending anything. And then, yeah, for this particular demo, I think I've been just, I'd spend about $1 for a week, for a week's deployment, because I deployed it last week to make it sure that it's working. And then, yes, so this is already like a working application. Um, Another thing that I want to show you as well is how it looks like in the back end. I mean, not in the back end, but in the code. So you can see we have the CI/CD is placed here, and then we have the back end, the front end, and then which is where the infrastructure as code is being placed. So if you will look at the Terraform, it looks like a YAML file. It's not a code. It's not the usual coding language that we used to have, like Python or TypeScript. But this is where we create all those resources that we will be needing, or the one that we have declared in our architecture earlier. And this will be used to deploy to our Azure account. What else? So for example, if I wanted to do a change in the button, for example, so I wanted to change a color of this submit button, it might take some time. So I'm just gonna make this big. It's gonna make the caption big, and then Control Alt, Control Z. So if I'm gonna git push this, so I pushed it, so it should trigger my pipeline here. So for example, if you have a team of back end, front end, and then AI engineers as well, they can work together on this repository, for example, and they can make changes, and the change will trigger the pipeline. For example, if they're working in development environment, and then they can, like collaborate with each other regardless of whatever they're working on, and still be able to produce a system that is actually working, that can be done, that can be deployed in production. We have changed it. Did we? Evaluate. It didn't change yet. But yes, the purpose of this is to show you that whenever teams are working together, the CI/CD pipeline is actually um, bringing everyone into one place, and then automates the deployment on whichever the team is working on. So in summary, for example, we have actually created, set up our Terraform as code, which is our infrastructure as code, and deployed the resources or the infrastructure into our Azure account. And then we have a GitHub Action CI/CD pipeline that deploys on every push, or on every push that um, a developer is doing to the main account, to the main branch. And then we use GitHub secrets actually. So I'm going to show you. In this deployment, we have GitHub secrets. So we have this called environment variables that we use in order for us to deploy, to be able to successfully deploy our resources. So it's also part of the process. And then we have built a front end, which is actually this one. And then at the back end of it is actually the .NET Web API. And then we have on the AI side of things, we have the evaluator of the eligibility of a student to be able to get into the admission. And then we're using Azure OpenAI for that. And then for the metrics, we have that resource here as well. I'll show you. So technically at home, if you have student accounts, you can register for a Microsoft Azure account, and then you can have that $140 uh, credits in which you can build stuff if you want to do some testing. And then make sure that if you're working, for example, in a repository, then you can connect the repository to your Azure, that in a way, when you want to deploy things from, or build your apps, you can always connect all the things together. So from VS Code, then it will trigger the repository. The repository will be the one who will help deploy and do all the infrastructure as code for you, and will deploy the resources onto your Azure account. So the app insights is actually looking like this in your Azure. So whenever you're doing some analysis of what your website is doing, or the performance of your website, this resource actually will help you give that information, like logging or the metrics. And eventually you can put that somewhere else. Maybe if you wanted to analyze it with the use of an MCP server or another AI application to do that for you, then you can use that as well. But this one is just like a start in which if you're building something and you have an AI app idea in place, these are the information that you might be needing, especially on the DevOps side of things. So for the key takeaways, whenever we build applications, it's always a good idea to put everything as code, regardless if it's your application, which is the usual, your front end, your infrastructure, um, which is also your CI/CD pipeline is also based there. Because it's useful in a way because it's version controlled. It's repeatable. You can deploy it once you're able to deploy it in dev. You're able to deploy it in production as well. And then if you're working in a team, it's everyone can review it through the code that you do, the code that you have built, and it's very similar to how you review your application code as well. And then with automation pipelines or automated pipelines, yeah, you don't need to really go through one by one and do a linting check or a scan of your image that you are wanting to build, because it has that automation that will check it for you. And also, yes, observe everything. Make sure that once you set up any application, you have observability set up in place. So I think that's everything for my presentation.